Hey guys, and welcome to today's tutorial on how to paint pallid flesh tones on a Chaos model. So what do I have in front of me? Well, we've got Chaos Sorcerer here, which we're going to do the pallid flesh on, and we've got our palette ready, wet palette. We've got some colors ready to go, and we're going to be building up this pallid flesh tone with blues. To keep it cold, a colder look, that always looks really cool on Chaos models. And then we're going to be using a combination of simple layering and highlighting, coupled with some glazing at the end to vary the skin tone and give you that dark look that you often see in Chaos models around the eyes. We've got some colors here, which I'll show you in a second, to give that kind of sinister, Chaos, like classic, I guess, Games Workshop look for a Chaos model. So yeah, just a nice simple way of learning how to build up layers, highlighting and glazing, and so you achieve a nice result relatively quickly. Something that you could potentially do across your army if you wanted to, but I guess this tutorial is more designed towards like a character model or the sergeant in your squad or something like that. So yeah, let's get started. So what do we have? Well, we're going to be using a dark blue. So I've got, let's move this guy out of the way. So we've got this night blue here from Game Color, but just something dark and deep. Blue is good. It doesn't have to be too dark, but mid to dark color is good. I've got this uniform gray here, which is relatively neutral. I guess from what I've seen, most miniature paints for grey tend to be on the warm side. It's hard to get like a truly neutral one. And what I mean by that is that if you add white to this, you'll notice it kind of goes a little bit sort of brown or yellow. So it's on the warm side. We want to have it a little bit more on the cool side. So something as neutral as possible is good. And the reason we have grey here is to balance the saturation of color as we move into those really pallid tones. And then we obviously have white here to get to a nice pallid color. And then for the glazing, to add in a bit of variation, we've got this violet here, this shade from Citadel. For the purples, we've got a little bit of red here. We may not use this, we'll just see how we go, but red's always good, or a crimson color is always good to add in for your flesh tones, regardless of what type of flesh it is. So we have that. And then finally, we definitely want to use a little bit of blue. So blue and purple will be the main colors. We may throw a little touch of red in there depending on how it looks, but I just got it out just so that you know that that's another color that would be worth using for pallid flesh tones. So yeah, we'll use a bit of that nightshade there. And yeah, that's it, and then we'll be able to achieve a nice result. So the first step though is to build up the base color, and as you can see here, I've primed this with a zenithal undercoat. You don't have to do that, but if you were to go from a black base, then I would suggest at least mixing let's say your mid-tone with a little bit of blue to do like just a slightly blue-grey, and probably paint that as the base. But you don't necessarily have to. The color we're going to do first probably will go over black quite well, but let's say you might have to do 2 coats. But a zenithal would be better for this. So if you're doing a zenithal, that's just a white or an off-white sprayed from above over a black undercoat, and that will be a better base to begin with because you've got that nice light color there, and so the pallid tones will come through a lot easier. But yeah, it's not essential. It just means you're going to have to do more coats. All right, let's get started. Okay, so we've got our like a one brush or something that's fine enough to do a small face like this, and we've got our colors in front of us. So what we want to do is start by grabbing a little bit of this blue, popping it over here just like that, and then adding a small amount of white to it next to it to start achieving a gradient, so you can start to see where the base is going to begin. We want it quite light. We're only wanting to do maybe like 2 to 3 layers. That's it for this skin color. So we don't want it to be too dark, otherwise we're not going to get that pallid color. So we just keep mixing in the white and just keep moving it down, and you're starting to see a nice little gradient happening, and this is informing you where you want to begin. So it's a good way to start, and also to learn about how colors interact and tonal ranges. So we want to probably be somewhere in here. in this little range so that we can build up to like a nice strong white, but it's still a little bit blue. So what we do is we add a little bit of this grey and pop it in next to it, maybe this side, okay, and then just drag that across, and let's see what happens when we add a little bit of this grey in. And we should be able to get something that's a little bit desaturated and paler, still with that blue in there. So yeah, you should be able to see that it's just slightly grayish, and hopefully not too yellow, and we don't really want too much yellow in there, but that looks about right. So we start adding little drops of water, maybe 2 or 3, to keep it quite thin. Okay, maybe blend in a little bit more of that color in there. We can bring some from the back here, that's fine. That's just making it a little more blue. And I think this is about where we want. So something like this, a couple of drops of water in there, quite thin. If you're going over a black base, maybe a little bit thicker, and that should do the job. And so we're going to start with this type of mid-tone. So in terms of color, it's mostly white with like a small amount of blue and a small amount of gray, and you'll end up with something like this. But as I said, if you do that gradient thing, you'll be able to easily tell where it needs to be, because it's not an exact science. It's not like a 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1. Blue, like deeply saturated colors like this, are very hard to control, and so you want to have this little gradient to help you out with that. So we start off, model in one hand, in front of you, nice and relaxed, and brush in the other, and we just begin by painting that on and having a look and seeing whether the color we're using is correct for what we want. So that's pretty close. It actually could do with being a little darker, so we might add a little bit more of the grey to it, just to tone it down slightly. There we go, that should be better. Okay, and we just begin again. That should be cool. Yep, you can see that. Try to get a little closer. Hopefully this camera adjusts. There we go. And we're just going to very carefully paint that in across the surface. And the reason why it's not too thick in consistency is because I am trying to utilize a little bit of that zenithal base that we have to help shade this as well. So some of that gradient across the surface will come through, and that's really helpful when you're building up like pallid skin tones. I've got another tutorial about doing subsurface scattering, like colors under the skin for monster flesh, and those principles apply here as well. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, go check that out, because that will also inform how to create hue variation in the skin to get a more, I guess, realistic result. You don't always want that, but it is a really fun challenge to do. And using like an academic model, like if you've got a 3D printer, then I offer 3D prints, so you could download one of those off my Blighted Gods website and use one of those to practice on, which is a really good one. But anyway, that's another topic for another time. So I'm going to go through and finish this, and I'll be back in a second. Okay, so the next step, we have the base color down. Okay, it's slightly off blue-white, a little bit desaturated. And now we want to build up the first layer. So now we're going to move down this little gradient here and into somewhere into this range here. So we'll just mix that up. So it's adding a little bit of white into that blue-gray to give us our first shade layer or highlight layer, whatever you want to call it. Okay, and a little tiny bit of water in there just to keep it thin. Okay, on the end of your brush, and we begin. So with this one now, we're moving up the surfaces, up to the raised areas on the face. So if you think of a cylindrical object, or like a tube, or a round object like an orange or an apple or something like that, when light hits it, the most raised area is going to be the brightest, and as it recedes across the side, it's going to get darker and darker, and you get a shadow. So on a face, you've got like cheekbone lines, you've got the eyebrow ridge, you've got the top of the cranium, you've got around the mouth, and along the jaw. And so these type of areas, you can already see here with my own light that's hitting it, we're getting natural shadows hitting the bottom underneath that cheekbone there, and under the brow. that's telling you exactly where you don't want to paint. So it's very useful when you've got a little light above you, because that's giving you all the information you need to know about where to apply. So we get the model in front of us, nice and easy, and we're going to start by hitting those raised areas and giving us that look. So we'll take a look at that. That's looking not too bad. We might just mix a little more of that grey in there just to soften that a little bit. Might be just a touch too bright. Always just test it and let it dry to see how bright it's actually going, because it will darken down a lot. So sometimes when you put it on, it seems a bit bright, and then it recedes away to nothing. So yeah, don't be too worried if it goes on a little light to start with. And so you want to leave like a little bit of shadow around the edges where this I guess the cowl that he's got on his head. So you get a little bit of shadowing happening. Now don't worry too much, because we're going to be adding those glazes, and the glazes are going to give us a lot of shadowing and so on. We're going to pop that around the edge and all that sort of thing to further increase the tonal range across the skin, which will really make the head pop and really come alive and give you a lot of contrast in the focal point. So on the model, when you're looking at it, you want your eye to be drawn to the most important area. That's the focal point. And in this case, it's usually the head, especially if the character has no helmet on, like with this, and we're doing flesh tones. We want to make sure that that's where your eye is drawn. So the most amount of contrast between darks and lights is what you want to help draw your eye. You can also do that by having a spot color or a unique color that only exists in sort of one place. That also draws your eye. So this model is mostly, well, it looks very blue here. It's actually very turquoisey, greeny blue, and by adding a bit of purple and blue, like a bit of purple and maybe even some of that crimson into the face, we're going to instantly be attracted to that, because now it's got the most interest, the most detail, and that's what you want. So I'm going to go through and continue to do that, and then we'll move on to the next step. All right, so let's take a look. So there we can see the build-up of those shadows. It's not just the light hitting it. There is now indeed, if we tip it like this, you might be able to see better. There is actually like a dark tone underneath and the light tone on top. And across that brow line there, we've got a few wrinkles. So we just draw the brush, across the raised bits, a couple of quick little marks like that, and you get those shadows. And around the temple there, a little darker, behind the eye socket there. So that's a real good base. So once you've got to this, you've now got some variation, and now all we want to do really is just do a little highlight, and that should be enough to start doing the glazes and giving us definition. And you could just stop right there, and that would be very, very fast. It's only very simple, just a few layers, and you can achieve a result. Working on a face, as I've said before in other tutorials about skin, when you're learning about layering, a face is actually one of the best places to practice this. It's a very small area. You can't really go too far wrong with it. Almost every color that exists in a face or under the skin. So if it's too green, if it's too this, if it's too that, it's actually all fine. It's more about your control of the paint and how you work that in, which will achieve the better result. So by practicing this, you're learning about control of the paint, how to water it down, how to apply it so that you get those smoother transitions. And you don't need like 100 layers to get that kind of definition. This is such a small area, you don't need much. 3 little steps is enough to visually make this thing pop. And the glazing, which is very, very soft and easy to do, will just give you that little bit of touch of color to vary up the skin. And so when you're looking at it from further away, it's going to read. And because you've added that contrast between the light skin or the dark skin and a light background, or whichever combination you're doing, it's going to really, really draw your eye and look cool on the tabletop, which is where all this stuff is going to end up, right? We're playing games with these things, so you want to make sure that you at least get it done, and get it on the tabletop. And this is a nice, fast, easy way to learn those kinds of techniques. So now we're going to do that little highlight. So on here we've got a little gradient, and we have this white, more whitish layer here, and we're going to use that to begin our highlight. So little touch of that grey in there just to maintain our desaturated colour, but not too much because it'll dull it down. Okay, that should be about right. Little touch of water to further soften this. Okay, and we might actually use a smaller brush. So this time I think this is like a 0 or something like that. Something with a finer point on it would be a good idea for this final step. And if we want to, we could do an extra little highlight, but we'll see how it is. It should be enough. So where are we going to put it? Well, we're going to put it across the very raised areas. So across that brow line, down the temple here, across the top of the cranium, along that cheekbone, a little bit around the mouth there, just to make that pop along the lower jaw there, and across the top of the nose. Basically, this is called the T section, right, in a face. It's this line across the brow and down the nose. That's where most of the light's going to hit. So that's where you put most of your highlights. But you know, you want to do a little bit around the other areas too, because you're going to see it from more than just one angle. So let's just throw a little bit. Is that in focus? Yep. So let's just throw a little bit across that brow just so you can see how light it gets. Okay, run up the side of that little temple there. Across there. Across the top of the cheekbone. Into under the eye. Okay. And just so you can see this. There we go. Alright, so you can start to see that there's a little bit more definition going on there. So I'm going to go through and finish that, and we'll be back in a second. And so here we are, the final highlight. So it's a little hard to see with this camera and setup. It's a little blown out, but there, you see there, it's picking up the shadows a bit better. So we can see that there is actually a lot of definition. So in reality, there's a lot more contrast happening here. So just trust me on that. When you do this, you're gonna see it yourself when you do it. It's gonna look nice. And so now we've got the basic layers all done. So now it's time for glazing. So we're gonna start with most likely the best one to start with, I think, will be maybe a touch of the blue, just because we already have the blue there, and we'll see how that goes. So let's open up our blue, and probably, well, we may as well open up all of them and get into it. So we'll get them all out, and move into the glaze. So we'll start with a little bit of blue, still using our fine detail brush. So we'll get a bit of this out on the palette. Okay, mix a bit of water with it, get it quite diluted, because this is a glaze, not necessarily like you would ink wash, you know, let's say a Space Marine armor panel where you're trying to create shadows in the creases, quite dark. You want this to be a bit more subtle, so it's not going to be quite as heavy. So it's something that's quite transparent, a little bit on the end of the brush. And the first place we want to do is around the edges of where the skin meets the other sections of the model, like this cowl. We're just going to start lining in a very small amount of this and test it, make sure it's got enough water, thin it down again if it feels like it's too much, and then go again. So we're just trying to just gently soften that in. Okay, is that in focus? There we go. A little bit in the eye. Okay, just lining it in gently under the brow there, softening that in the mouth. Okay, running it along the base of the jawline. Okay, around the top. Okay, and so on. So I'll be back in a second once it's dry. Okay, so that's just adding a little more blue into those shaded areas. Now don't worry about if you get a little bit of staining, like I don't know if you can see that on there, there's a little bit of watermark staining from the glaze. That's okay. We'll come back in to do a little touch-up highlight right at the end, just to blend that stuff in, but it shouldn't matter too much. So now we're going to move on to some of this purple. So we get a little bit of the purple out, a lot of water, so 3 or 4 drops of water to the drop of ink, and we're looking at something about that, and we want to add this into certain areas, so mostly around the eye. So we want to try to deepen that eye socket and get it, you know, quite purple. So we're just going to very carefully drop that in there and just add let's see, yep, the mouth. Okay, can you see that? Pretty cool, right? So it's starting to look like that sort of like sinister, chaosy kind of thing. Really simply, really easy. You know, this flesh scheme isn't like, you know, doesn't take you very long, and you start to see a nice clean result. So we might drop a little bit more of that around the edges as well. So I'll go ahead and do that, maybe add a few more little spots of that color, but that's looking really cool. So I'll be back in a second. All right, let's see what we've got. See if we get that nice and close. So there we go. We've got all that nice dark deep purple in those eye sockets. We're pretty much there. Now unfortunately, as I said before, this footage is a little bit blown out, but I can assure you it's a much more more contrasting and deeper result in reality. It's not quite as soft as what you're seeing in this video footage, but when you try this yourself, you'll notice that straight away. You get a nice stark contrast, very, very evocative of a Chaos Space Marine. And so the final step here is just to clean up. We could add some red, but I feel for the color scheme we have, the red probably won't work. But if you had a different color scheme, actually adding a little bit of magenta or into that, maybe that crimson, might actually be appropriate. It depends on your color. Like if you're doing a Corn Warrior or something like that, then I would definitely be adding those reds in, or even like a Slanesh warrior of some sort, you might add a little bit of red in there. But for this particular color scheme, I don't think it will really work. But we've got enough of that contrast there. There we go. I think if I shadow it more, you can kind of see how deep it is. Okay, so the final step here is just to clean up. So we've got a few little watermarks. So we want to come in with our color that we've already established over here, build it back up if it's dried out. Okay, add a little bit more of that gray in there. Find that color again. You can do it next to it so that you can see it correctly. Okay, something around this area here. Okay, add your water, a couple of drops. Run off the end of your brush there. Okay, maybe a little paler there. Keep it thin. So this layer, we don't want it to be too thick because we want it nice and soft. Not a huge amount of paint on your brush, so you don't blob it all on. We want you know, not very much. You can see how you can even see the bristles. Right, it's very thin. We're just going to very gently feather in across the raised areas and across anywhere where there's a little bit too much of that stain, like here across the jaw. It's just got a little bit too much purple there. So just where the edge of the mouth is, we just very carefully just feather in a little bit of this color, just like that. Gently build it up and soften that transition just in there where there's a watermark. Across the top of that cheekbone there. Soften that up. Okay, and anywhere else you see, so across the top of the ridge, the brow, got a little bit of that blue watermark. So we just clean that up. Okay, maybe across there as well. Across there. Okay, just to clean it up. So I'll go through and just do a little bit of a touch up, and I'll be back in a second. And now we have the final result. So let's have a look. So I just went back and just retouched up the highlight to blend off some of those watermarked edges. Okay, and then I just blacked out the eyes, put a little dot of white in there, and then used a little bit of this yellow shade. Just very, very carefully just dotted that white to tint it into a slight yellow. Because a yellowish yellow or yellow orange sort of contrasts with purple, so just to give it a little bit of difference against that purple, and which will make it pop. As we said, that'll give you that little bit of focal interest in the face. And this guy's trim is going to have a lot of bone and yellows in there anyway, so that'll all come together in the final once all the rest of it is painted. And that's something you consider when you're doing your eyes. You can just, like, if it wasn't a necessarily a saucer or whatever, you could just do the sort of slightly off-white eyes with a little dot of black for the pupil. But it definitely looks creepier if there's no pupil in there. It's just like one color, and a little bit of a tinted color isn't really nice. Even on your basic guys, like that off yellow, or depending on what the pallid skin tone is, it comes out really cool. So definitely something worth a try. Or you could even do glow effects. You could extend that glow around there, but you'll lose a lot of that nice dark shadowing, so I probably wouldn't do that on this. I'd leave it, because then you get that sinister look. You can see from the front there, that sort of gives him that sort of really classic chaosy look. And yeah, so I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope it helps you with your layering, highlighting, and glazing, which are all like basically the fundamentals of painting. And I hope you can apply this to your own stuff in the future. And yeah, I really enjoy doing it. It's a fun way to practice painting skin. And that's about it. I'll leave you with a overview and the recipe at the end, and a close-up view of this model, just so you can see it a little bit clearer. But otherwise, have a great day, enjoy your hobby, and I'll catch you on the next one.